Well, just because tulip time in Holland is canceled doesn't mean that there aren't tulips still coming up. You can see some tulips here in my front yard. Cars whizzing by, but got some tulips here planted. Some of them haven't bloomed yet, but as you can see there, some are still kind of coming up, not in full bloom, but quite a few of them did bloom. And so some of them are still kind of sprouting up. But today we're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation here, and we'll get started on that. All right, so here we go. All right, it's a nice warm day. You kids have a little bit less than 2 weeks from the time of this video to study and prepare for your AP exam. So here we go. Today we're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's just get a good little screenshot for you guys. But the Emancipation Proclamation, it's very controversial. It's attacked on both sides. People attack it. People say, look, you're doing too much to help the slaves. At the same time, people are attacking it and saying you're not doing enough at all to help the slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation is attacked on both sides. It's wildly unpopular at first because a lot of the abolitionists aren't happy, and some are, but a lot of them aren't happy because it's not going far enough in their minds. And then a lot of other people aren't happy because it's attacking slavery. It's attacking the institution of slavery, and that's going to make the South fight harder, or that's going to greatly upset the South. That's, hey, if you free the slaves, hey, they're going to move north and take my factory job away from me because they're going to be willing to work for less. So this is very, very controversial. It upsets lots and lots of people. In fact, part of the reason the draft riots happened in 1863, the New York City draft riots, when they have a draft to conscript, to put people into the army, the Irish immigrants riot in New York City. And one of the reasons they riot is, why should we moved here to kind of get away from European problems? Why should we come to America and then have to fight and potentially die so you can free the slaves who are then going to come up north and steal our jobs from us? That's what a lot of the Irish immigrants were saying or thinking at the time in the New York City draft riots. So what does the Emancipation Proclamation do? Number one is it allowed black men to join the U.S. Army. Black men had been prohibited from joining the Army at this time, around the time of the Civil War. There had been some black men in the military in various capacities beforehand, like in the War of 1812 with Andrew Jackson. But the fact of the matter is, African American men were not allowed in the U.S. Army at this time, and this will change that. Now, unfortunately, for the longest time, they're still paid less and can't rise up to certain ranks and so forth. So there's still discrimination in the Army, especially at the time of the Civil War. But it allows African Americans to join the U.S. Army, and gives a lot of them a sense of pride and satisfaction to fight for the country, to wear the U.S. belt buckle, to have the eagle and all that. So that's very important for the Emancipation Proclamation. And think about this. It allows the U.S. Army to grow in size. Now, it's segregated units, what they would call colored troops, but it would grow. The U.S. Army was able to grow in size. Most of the black men who had been in the Army were more kind of like digging latrines, moving supply wagons, things like that. This is going to allow them to fight too. So it's increasing the amount of combat soldiers the U.S. Army has. At the same time, it's also weakening the Confederate forces, because African Americans aren't fighting for the Confederate Army, but they're doing a lot of jobs. And so a lot of slaves who are then freed or escape, who come north, some of them then join the U.S. Army. So at the same time, it's reducing the Confederate labor supply by encouraging slaves to escape or to be free, and then some of them kind of join the Army. So it's kind of almost like a twofold in those situations. The second thing it does, besides the Army, this is the one that most people forget. This is the one people remember is the second thing. It allows the U.S. Army to free slaves in rebel areas. It was very controversial at the time. Like I already said, a lot of Northerners didn't want the Emancipation Proclamation. Some did. The public was already kind of moving that way, but it was still extremely controversial even in the North. But you can only free slaves in the rebel areas under rebellion. As of January 1st, 1863, all areas still under rebellion would be henceforward and forever set free. Lincoln announces this policy September 22nd, 1862. So you can see he's giving them a few months, the public, to kind of get used to it. A little bit of September, all of October, all of November, all of December, to kind of get used to this policy. And he was hoping, A, the public would get used to it, but also B, maybe some of the South would just, hey, put down their guns. We can preserve the Union. Would weaken the South. So he's going to free all slaves in rebel areas. And he announces this in September 22nd. It's no coincidence. In fact, he had already written this a while back, months prior. In fact, in August, not September, but August 22nd, he had responded to, he had got this letter, an open letter in the newspaper. Basically, this guy was criticizing him for not doing enough to help the slaves, and he responded like, as president, my job is to preserve the Union. That's my job. I haven't changed my often expressed wish that everywhere every man could be free. However, my job is to preserve the Union, and that comes first. If I could free all the slaves, I would do it. If I could free some of the slaves while keeping other people in bondage, while preserving the Union, I would do that. Lincoln's famous reply to Garrison. But the fact of the matter is the Battle of Antietam comes, and some people see this is a really weird battle. A lot of people see it as a draw. Both sides claim victory, but the fact of the matter is the Confederate Army invaded Maryland. Maryland then didn't get captured by the Confederates. The Union Army fought the Confederates in Sharpsburg, Maryland. The Confederates retreated. The Union forces severely outnumbered the Confederate forces, but the Confederate forces kind of held on and retreated at their own will. And so the fact of the matter is both sides kind of declare victory, but the fact of the matter is Maryland was kind of like a neutral state, a border state. They had slavery legal, but hadn't joined the Confederacy. There's parts of the states that were very sympathetic to the Confederates. There were parts of the state that were very sympathetic to the Union. And there are many people in Maryland who just want to be left alone. But the fact of the matter is a lot of people saw it as the Confederates invaded Maryland, and the Union Army pushed them out. And so many in the North celebrated. This great victory. It's the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. And so then when everyone's kind of celebrating in the North, this national mood's good, then he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But he was actually waiting for victory. He had written the Emancipation Proclamation months before, but it was kind of deemed too controversial to kind of just make public immediately. So he was waiting for the public mood to be buoyed up by a major victory. Lincoln considers Antietam that, and then makes the Emancipation Proclamation essentially announced to the public to take effect on January 1st, 1863. Why didn't it free slaves in all areas? Why didn't it free slaves in the border states? Well, this is a two-part question. Number one, there's legal reasons. The honest fact is Lincoln's using executive powers here. This is an executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. He's using... he says, look, slavery is constitutionally protected. In a state like Maryland, for example, which hasn't broken off the country, the fact of the matter is slavery is constitutionally protected at this time before the 13th Amendment. Slavery is constitutionally protected. The president can't just snap his fingers and say, I'm going to confiscate your property just because, especially property that's protected by the U.S. Constitution. So for legal reasons, Lincoln argues, look, I'm the commander-in-chief. I'm the president. I have certain war powers. I have executive powers. And the fact of the matter is, areas under rebellion, I have the right to put down a rebellion. I have the right to confiscate property of people under rebellion. And so for legal reasons, I have the right to take property away from areas under rebellion, including slaves, and set them free. But I don't have those same legal reasons in areas that aren't under rebellion. So there is a legal reason to why he's not freeing slaves in the border states, but only the slaves under the areas of rebellion. There's also political reasons. It's hard to win the Civil War. 1861 to 1865. Some modern estimates, you hear different numbers. Usually hear 620,000 Americans die in the U.S. Civil War. Some modern estimates say it's closer to 750,000 or 800,000 or even a little bit more. But the fact of the matter is, it's hard to win the U.S. Civil War. Do you want to anger the loyal border states and make it even more difficult? Because a lot of the border states, for example, you look at Missouri. If I remember right, 42 regiments fought at the Battle of Vicksburg, whose home state was Missouri. And of those 42 Missouri regiments fighting at the Battle of Vicksburg, if I'm not mistaken, it was 23 fought for the North, 19 fought for the South. If you start fighting in Missouri to free slaves at this moment, you might lose a lot of that pro-union support. And if you lose a lot of that pro-union support, you very well might lose the war. Supposedly, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but supposedly Lincoln once said, I would like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky, showing the importance of these border states. The border states that didn't succeed, but had slavery legal, and about half their men fought for one side, and about half their men fought for the other side of their fighting men who did end up fighting. These states are Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia breaks off of Virginia and becomes a state in 1863, Kentucky, and Missouri. These are called border states. They're loyal, but they have slavery legal. Border states. And so there's political reasons. Some people, like Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionists and civil rights activists who even stood up for women's rights and women's voting rights, also says this. Also says, well, look, this is a bad message. Because what you're saying is, it's wrong to own slaves unless you're loyal to the Union, like these border states are. Or it's wrong to own slaves unless you're loyal to the Union, like these border states are. So slavery's wrong unless you're loyal, and that's a bad moral message to send. But Lincoln has his legal reasons. Lincoln has his political reasons. So to me, it kind of makes sense why Lincoln did what he did. But you can also understand why Frederick Douglass is upset. I can understand what Frederick Douglass is saying, even though I think Lincoln has a good legal reason and a good political reason to do this. So basically this right here makes the Civil War have a dual purpose with a new birth of freedom. Makes the Civil War have a dual purpose with a new birth of freedom. Think about this. The Civil War was about preserving the Union. The South, in my mind, is breaking off to protect the institution of slavery. But the North is fighting to preserve the Union. And most Northerners, at least at the start of the Civil War, weren't abolitionists. But now the Civil War has a dual purpose. It's not just fighting to preserve the Union. It's also fighting to end slavery. And when Lincoln gives his famous Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, he talks about this new birth of freedom. This new birth of freedom. This idea of, we're going to have an expansion upon the American Revolution. He opens up the Gettysburg Address talking about the founding of the country with the American Revolution. And this country was founded on liberties. And now we're going to have this new birth of freedom, this expansion of liberties. And we can't let the soldiers who have already died, places like Antietam and Gettysburg, we can't let them die in vain. And part of it is to preserve the Union, but part of it's this new birth of freedom. Why was the 13th Amendment necessary? Well, you should already kind of be able to answer this based on what I've already said. The Emancipation Proclamation may have been illegal. It's dubious about whether or not the president, the commander-in-chief, can take away slave property forever, not just temporarily, but forever, henceforth and forever free. Does the president have that power? People were literally challenging the Emancipation Proclamation in court at the time of the 13th Amendment. We don't know how the courts would have eventually wound up ruling, because the 13th Amendment makes it a moot point. The the Constitution's been amended to prohibit slavery, so therefore the courts aren't going to hear a question on the Emancipation Proclamation because it's already a moot point. But the Emancipation Proclamation may have been illegal, making the 13th Amendment even more important. Also, the 13th Amendment is also extremely important because the fact of the matter is it would have ended up freeing most, but not all slaves. Remember the slaves in those 5 border states I mentioned, Delaware, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, would technically still be legal as long as those states supported it. But there are also some areas of the Confederacy that had already been capitulated and defeated at the time of January 1st, 1863. And technically that wouldn't free their slaves because they're not under rebellion at the time of January 1st. Most slaves would have ended up getting freed had the Emancipation Proclamation run its course and been determined to be illegal by the courts, which we don't know if that would have been. But the fact of the matter, there was certainly a need for the Emancipation Proclamation to be backed up by the 13th Amendment, because A, it didn't do the whole job, and B, the honest truth is it may have been illegal. So this is just like a brief discussion on the Emancipation Proclamation here. So the fact of the matter is, there we go. There's a lot of confusion around it. This is just kind of help you out with kind of like what's going on. Have a good day, guys. Stay positive. Hey, maybe you'll see some tulips down in your area.